Thank you, and I would like to thank the State Library in Prešove and the Romani Documentation and Information Center, and personally to Janka Gaborova for inviting me to present here and share my research that is more related to a global history of Romani literature. And if I ask you, I believe that most of you would say that Romani literature is young and underdeveloped and only oral and so on. And I hope that at the end of these slides and my talk, I would have changed your mind, or you would have other reflections on the history of Romani literature and its and how it looks like. So, how I define Romani literature by a very short but still very inclusive and broad definition. So that would be works that target Romani audience among others, and also that are authored by Roma, but certainly there are also publications that are co-authored by Roma or other authors that is considered Romani literature. And Romani literature already has its historiography. So we have publications on the history of Romani literature, and here I exemplify a few of them. And that said, I embrace a historical approach into looking at Romani literature. So I'm more interested into the personal agency of those who create literature, the circumstances, the policies in the surrounding environment, rather than the content. Of course, I look at the content and at the common narratives that we encounter in Romani literature, regardless of the region in which it is created. And I propose in my publications a periodical view of Romani literature, because of course we know some of you have historical background in education, and of course we know that there are different environments in imperial periods, then the interwar period, post-war Europe, and so on. And very much state policies in many countries also reflect this general environment and how it treats policies related to Romani publications or expressions in the Romani language or by Roma authors. I'm not going to elaborate, you see the slides, but important thing to mention is that now we live in the 21st century, we have migrations, we have digital environments, and we also have many networks, mainly of Romani activists that collaborate together across borders. And within these networks also we have a lot of collaboration in Romani literature. And these are just examples. This is a periodical publication from Finland. Katici is probably one of the most famous books by a Roma author in Sweden, and is part of the Swedish literature canon. So almost every kid in Sweden would have read Katici. And I think you also have translations that are distributed here. Then also educational materials. And of course, now Romani literature or other forms that reflect and are based on Romani literature are now in digital forms, like the Romani Paramici or Romani fairy tales that are part of the Radio Romano, the Swedish national radio. And this is just examples of many covers that represent different genres in Romani literature. And this is a wonderful book that has been published by the Roma Museum in Brno, a bilingual publication of short stories. And important point to make also is that teaching materials also are based very often on content produced, literary content like poems, fairy tales, and many authors would also create textbooks. And of course, the creation of textbooks and other materials for education would very much be dependent on national policies that support this kind of education, because we know that just existing of educational material without implementation would have more symbolical value than any other. And this is also an example of digital presence of Romani literature. These were books produced in Riezande Romani dialect. That is one of the dialects spoken in Sweden. And these are books that you can get not online or download on your phone. And now I'm moving to slides that would elaborate on some of the common, to my mind, misconceptions related to Romani literature, and I will argue against them. So actually, first writings in Romani would be recorded much earlier in the 16th century, and as most other languages that become written or in written form, this would be religious translations, so prayers to God and so on. And we know that this is a pattern in which many vernacular languages become written through religious translations. The misconception is that Romani literature is very young and lacks diversity. So what I argue is that actually Romani literature repeats the pattern of all European languages becoming written through writing religious text, through writing folklore, so an oral form becomes written through collection, comments, and so on, in the spirit of the Romantic nationalism. And what I'm giving here are also examples of materials that were not necessarily published in books. So these are collections of folklore done by a Roma man himself. And also on the other hand, you can see a correspondence of Roma with one non-Roma teacher and collector of folklore, Johann Miškov. So actually to demonstrate that there were also epistolaric writings in the Romani language. And those who can read the Romani can probably recognize words and read the postcard. And this is just an illustration of the diversity. So we had a project that finished this year, Roma Interbellum, about researching Roma activism, including publications in the interwar years. And we published a book, Roma Writings, that is open access on the internet and contains a large bibliography of Romani literature produced in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm just giving here the numbers of publications until the Second World War and a number of periodicals, just to exemplify the diversity and the existence of materials in many countries. Until the mid of the 20th century. And you could often read in many publications that overview the history of Romani literature that Roma writers would appear and Romani literature would appear only after the Second World War, mainly referring to the 60s and 70s and so on. In fact, actually, Romani literary texts were existing much before that. And those who are into Romani literature would probably know the name of Ferenc Stojka, who is more famous for his contribution to the creation of a dictionary, of a Romani dictionary, but actually for the Romani literature he's much more important because he has authored drama texts that were not that famous, probably also because the access of Hungarian language is probably not that well read. If it was in, let's say, another language, at least for me, it's not possible to read this drama. But nevertheless, if we look at the history of modern drama and drama texts created by other authors in Europe, the appearance of these drama texts are completely synchronic to the appearance of many other dramas in a European context. And then the memory about Ferenc Stojka, even though he's not largely known beyond the context of maybe Hungary, there is a sort of revitalization of the memory about him. And there is even a prize named after Ferenc Stojka for literary achievements that is given annually by Kali Sara, which is the National Union of Roma in Croatia. Then other important point that I would like to make is the fact that Romani periodicals play important role in Romani literature development, and I would argue for including Romani periodicals in the historical overview and analysis of Romani literature, and I look forward to hearing the talk by Janka tomorrow that makes analysis of the content of a newspaper, because we know that publishing a book is one thing, but publishing a smaller piece in a periodical is much easier in terms of resources and so on. And this is, of course, practice that we know has been existent among many communities and national elites before nation states were formed. You often would have periodicals that would proclaim the national ideas, and patriotic texts or poems or folklore or any kind of materials would be placed on the pages of these periodicals. And Romani periodicals do not make exclusion, and they are very important as communicating platform of Roma activism. And this is, you can see, it's a comic strip in the 1930s. So in the Soviet Union, in the interwar period, we had a rich production in Romani language, including periodicals, including comics that was produced. Of course, it has a lot of propagandic content in it, because the Rom Papurka, who lives nomadic life, he just joins a factory and so on. But it is very, very interesting to know that. Also, another periodicals are given here, not only from the interwar years, but also from the Romano Lil, published in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s, and many more examples can be given in this respect. Then also, there are many texts that remain only in manuscript form that were authored by Roma but never made it to the public, meaning they were not published. And the more I research, the more novels I find that are of a different nature. Some of them, unfortunately, are not well preserved. Yugoslavian context is the one that I have researched the most. And Svetozar Simic was a Roma activist and a student in law at the Belgrade University in the 1930s. And he, among other things that he did as being editor of a newspaper and also founder of Roma organizations, he also authored at least 2 novels that are autobiographically inspired in a way. Unfortunately, one of them was rejected by a mainstream publishing house. And of course, we know that there are a lot of investments that are needed to publish a novel even today. And I think this is the reason why we don't have that many novels authored by Roma, because it needs a lot of time devoted by a professional writer, and also because a lot of investment is needed and many publishers would not bet on a non-famous author. Then I'm moving to another point I would like to make, that is that Romani activists and visionists work for Romani education and Romani studies. And one thing that we can repeatedly hear would be that the Romani oral tradition impedes writing forms and Roma are resistant to education. But actually, if we look at the number of publications, and especially in the number of books, of textbooks that are produced mainly by Roma when it comes to Roma education, this points to exactly the opposite. And it is important also to know that very often authors of Romani texts would be generally Romani activists. So writing would be only one of the activities that these individuals would do to communicate or to shape their work for the Roma community. And here we have a textbook, the first one that was produced by Hristo Kjuchukov, that is Bulgarian pedagogy expert and a linguist that I believe most of you know. The same is Lexa Manush, author of children books, translator, and activist based in Latvia, but also living in the Soviet Union. And Grafemari is another recently produced textbook in Serbia, co-authored by Rajko Đurić, a famous Romani activist and sociologist, and Luan Koko, who is also a state servant and a Roma individual. Then also, another important point that I would like to make is that Roma women are often pioneers in some activities when it comes to Romani writing, whereas there is a very often repeated statement how oppressive Roma culture is to Roma women, how they are double discriminated, first on the basis of their ethnicity, gender, and so on. In fact, and I have put here slides from the Finnish context. One is the one that Sofia Schwarz, my colleagues who worked in the Interbellum project, Raluca Roman and Risto Blomster, they actually found out that Sofia Schwarz was a Romani teacher and, as a matter of fact, one of the first female teachers in the Finnish context of that time. And the same goes for Miranda Volstranda, who is in European context also an important figure, but also author of a textbook produced in Finland in the 1990s. And also, we know that names like Elena Lackova or Filomena Franz or Chaya Stoica, women who were often the first to write about certain issues that relate to the historical memory of the community or of their experiences. And this is also something that we have to remember, the Romani female agency, not only in the community, but also in writing and public activities. And when we look at the Czech context today, actually the literary scene is almost completely dominated by female authors, which is interesting phenomenon in itself. And if we look statistically and globally at the proportion between male and female authors in Romani literature, it is the same proportion as we say in the general world literature, which is about 75 to 25%. But as I said, in some countries, actually we see more women writing. Also, Sweden is one example where maybe we would have 50-50 or even more than 50% of Roma authors who are females. And this is just also an interesting example. I'm currently working on a project documenting Romani presence in Iceland. And Rebecca Dimitri was a Roma woman born in Hungary who was coming with her family to Iceland in 1911 and 1912. And 1913, she was based in Sweden and sending letters to their friend Mishkov, that I already mentioned, in Denmark. And as a matter of fact, this family produced 120 letters. That was before the Second World War altogether, the number. And I think this is quite impressive number for a community that would often be stereotyped as completely lacking any writing habits, not to mention letters and so on. And just to continue the point of the female agency, some of the most famous authors from different countries and contexts that were quite often pioneering in writing, activism, and in terms of public speaking for the Roma. And just few examples from today. These are all books published in the Nordic countries. But the point here is that very often there is autobiographical materials or fiction based on biographical experience. That is also a pattern, of course, that we see in all other countries. Then also another misconception that would be existing in Romani studies in general, but also beyond it, that a Romani culture is oral and Roma are not interested in history, that the Roma communities are historical, they don't have the historical memory or so on. But actually I could see that very often many Roma authors would be back to their history or will reproduce historical narratives, be them popular or be it something that is experienced by the community itself. And here we have just a few examples in which there is reference to historical events and historical contexts. And this is a very common thing that we see. And even in contemporary memoirs, like for instance, Oksana Marafiotti, Damian Lebas, who is a UK Romani author, they would write about their experiences and about their reflections, travelogues or memoirs and so on. But they would often also refer to historical events that Roma experienced. And of course, the Second World War would be a core narrative that would appear as a reference in many authors' works. And also, this is just my final slide with publications that were produced by Roma authors from Kosovo or from Yugoslavia that actually treat the topic of the war in Kosovo in the 1990s and the destiny of the Roma who were victimized basically by the two fighting sides. And even though now I think that Romani scholarship doesn't do justice to these events, and we I don't think I can point out to any research that is made on these events. Actually, in Romani literature, we have at least 5 books that deal from a fictional or fictionalized point of view with the treatment and the destiny of Roma in Kosovo, and these are just 2 of them. But Nejmedin, Nejo, the one who is author of the book My Bloody Heart, has 3 more books about this. And this is it, and I'll be happy to receive your questions that go beyond the presentation maybe, but are related to Romani literature. Thank you for your attention.